in the midst of a huge transformation where peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I'm Senior Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I'm super excited to welcome our next guest onto the interview series, Clarissa Fuselier. She is the Operations Program Manager at Disco and founder of Inclusion.Logic. Clarissa, thank you so much for being here. If you want to share a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how exactly you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Nice. All right. Yeah, thank you. So, yes, I go by pronouns she and her. Very excited to be here. And wow, thinking about what do I want to be when I grow up? There were a number of things. I think it kind of, when I talk about it, when hindsight is 2020, when I start thinking about all the different things that I wanted to be when I grow up, like it changes as you grow up a little bit. But I think the key things that I wanted was at one time I wanted to be a teacher. And I used to remember, having my stuffed animals on my bed and like teaching them class. I did, funny enough about it is I wanted to be an epidemiologist when I was around. And I know it seems like really strange and out of the blue, but I think that was the time that that movie Outbreak had came out. And I was just fascinated by biology at the time and wanting to solve issues around diseases and viruses. And then, of course, like I've always wanted to be a writer. So I know these things kind of seems like they're kind of all over the place, but I think when looking back, it always seemed to be something where I had a job that helped others and also helped spread knowledge. Because my parents always taught me that knowledge was power. And so when you are spreading that as a teacher, or you're spreading that information as a writer, or even you're helping others as like solving diseases and issues with epidemics as an epidemiologist, I think that all kind of, tallied up to me just being a kid that wanted to do all the things. And because having an environment that I grew up in where learning was just so highly encouraged, it just kind of inspired me to branch out into the world of just like sharing information and learning it.
I love that. I feel like in your current role, you're helping people every day and spreading that knowledge and education and really empowering folks with that information as well. How do you think your personal journey has really led you up until this point today, launching your diversity, equity, and inclusion consultancy business, Inclusion.Logic?
Yeah, I think I was always heading towards being a change agent. When I was in college, I was um, a resident assistant, an RA, or a dorm mom. They call them so many
Yeah.
names now, right? But I really just got into it for like the free room and board, because I was a poor college student. But it also, like, one of the things that you had to do there was create just educational and awareness and social programs for those who are on your floor or in your dorm. And so I gravitated toward that because I was able to provide like awareness and safety, and of course even a sense of belonging, which was a huge part of those programs. Being an RA, you have all of these college students who are here probably alone for the first time in their lives, trying to find out where they belong, how they fit in, how will they have their own social connections. And it's like the first time that you're just kind of like out in the world and like finding yourself. And so I enjoyed doing that. And then I think when I started just moving on to that into outside of college and in the corporate world, I always was, it always meant a lot to me for your workplace to be, I would guess I would say harmonious, even though I know realistically not everything can work, in harmony. But I think the part of it that it mattered to me the most was just people having a sense that the work that they did matter and they were treated with respect. We've all had stories where, we had to work at places where the job conditions wasn't that great. Sometimes there were safety issues. Sometimes there's leadership in management issues where you feel like you're not treated fairly or treated with respect. And that always mattered to me. And through my career, I think I always, like I said, if there was a such thing as an alternate universe. Somewhere in one of those alternate universes, I am like deep in human resources. Like I'm a human resources person, probably like a head or a chief people officer, because that's always been really important to me, is making sure that employees felt comfortable and safe and felt like they can thrive. Because there's so many people and so much talent out there. They're super ambitious, but we've all kind of experienced, what it's like to not have a healthy work environment. And then these last 6 years of, we've seen so much injustice in and outside the workplace. I just wanted to help change that. A healthy work environment can yield so much innovation and equity. I know there are organizations out there that are very serious about committing to that change. So I just kind of found that as a fuel for me to help them create those better workplaces. And inclusion has always been like a part of my DNA. So I've always felt like, well, I'm just going to go out there and I'm just going to do it, because I know there's companies out there that wants to do this work, but they just need that guidance. They don't know where to start. So I just, got it going.
I love that. I think it's really important to intentionally create that sense of inclusion and belonging at organizations. And you mentioned safety, and I definitely agree that we all have our personal experiences with organizations that really didn't provide that for us as well and set up the conditions for success. In your experience, how do you intentionally cultivate a workplace with that psychological safety?
Yes. So I think what sometimes gets muddled into the discussion of psychological safety is there's some people feel like it doesn't take into accountability, but it does. Like it does so much. It's really, one, you have to be willing to lead by example. And this is not only for leadership to do, this is for anyone in the company to do. It's important to understand that just because an organization says that they believe in psychological safety doesn't mean it just kind of magically manifests. It requires building that trust. And every time a situation presents itself, that's another opportunity that you have to choose to uphold psychological safety in your circle. And psychological safety, for those who may not really understand what that means, it means that there is an environment where you feel safe and comfortable being able to explore, being able to learn, and being able to make mistakes without feeling like you're going to be uh, demonized or vilified for making that said mistake. Especially in the workplace, that's super important. And if we're doing this work of inclusion, you have to have that psychological safety, because we're in a process of unlearning just as much as we're learning. And when you're unlearning, you're going to come into conflicts where you may have said something or done something where it is no longer acceptable. And that fear of not making a mistake usually puts people in paralysis. You can't make change if you're standing still, you know. Um, so, for example, as a former people manager, I made it a point to share with my team when I did make a mistake, because I wanted them to know there's always this feeling with these power dynamics, and it's such an important thing to pay attention to in the workplace, that you as a leader are seen sometimes as infallible, like you're not supposed to make a mistake. You're like, but I don't want people to, you can't relate to someone who feels like they're infallible and they're a robot. I'm human. I'm going to make mistakes, and that's okay. What I do is I focus on making myself accountable for that mistake, and also share openly how I will fix it. And that could be whether it's learning more, being able to commit to learning more, being able to collaborate with someone, and or simply apologizing, and the best, change, the best apology is change behavior, right? So you have to make it okay for people to be in an environment where they can disagree, and being able to establish an environment of learning. And how else will we get better, right? You can't innovate and create change in a state of constant fear. And when you don't have that psychological safety in your circle, you're going to be living in fear. So you have to give yourself and others that freedom to explore, and share. And you can only successfully do that when you intentionally create a space for that.
Absolutely. It's easy to say, it's okay if you make a mistake and that's something that you won't be penalized for. But in actuality, if leaders and managers aren't modeling that behavior, how often is someone going to own up to that or just feel comfortable kind of having that conversation? It doesn't just happen. Actions have to align with values and words
Exactly.
consistent showing up there. In terms of equity, how can a company or leaders continue to create non-negotiables for that equity at work? I've heard some organizations, doing preventing Zoom fatigue by setting up no video meetings, or
Mhm.
making sure that you're having conversations around when people do their best work too asynchronously. What are your thoughts there?
Yes, yes. In this, past couple of years during the pandemic, there's been a lot of paradigm shifts in the workplace just due to how many companies have to work now. And I love that a lot of companies are starting to approach that. I would say that my challenge when I tell like clients and when I'm speaking to other organizations is that you need to ask the question, who does this process or cultural norm like include, like just really start to think that out, and then on the flip side you have to say who could possibly be excluded due to this cultural norm or process. Like we've talked about a lot in this space around the need for being on all the time, like that feeling of needing to be on, like uh, when we talked about Zoom fatigue, just taking into account now that we're in different spaces where most people are at home. You have people that have families, you have people that are caring for some of their older loved ones at home, being on camera, all the time, having to be super duper presentable all the time is super draining, considering just the current state we're living in, and just everyone has their own conflicts and challenges in their daily lives that now is like a little bit blended since a lot of us are working from home. And so you have to take into account, like, we had this standard before of always kind of butts in seats, but now we have to ask ourselves, like, who does that exclude by having that cultural norm? Like, where's the benefit for that? And is that really a benefit if it's excluding a number of like your employees who have this amazing talent that could be missing out because you feel like you need to have everybody adhere to this same standard? um, I'm hoping that companies are starting to re-examine their cultural norms and kind of ask, like, is this really the way we do it? I love that there's been some more talk around things like happy hours and like these social functions that are created around these workplaces, and say, do we really want to set that tone that this is all we have as our social interaction? Who does that possibly exclude? Do we want to make it seem that that you have to attend these type of um, events even though it's really not your jam? Like, you really need to kind of step back and say, like, this doesn't work for everyone. How
Right.
can create some standards where everyone can feel included? And I mean, it's possible. You don't necessarily have to have a social environment around in your company where everyone drinks. Not everyone drinks,
Right.
right? And not everybody has time right after work to be able to actually be able to socialize. People have other engagements and environments. So I think when companies are and leaders are thinking about these non-negotiables, they have to take a step back, and maybe they might not be able to do it on their own, and that's important. You don't want to do this in a vacuum. That's what you have your other employees who, hopefully, you have some champions there where you can bounce ideas off of, or reach out to third party folks, like other inclusion consultants, to kind of help you see where some of these things may seem a cultural norm to you that works, but it may not if you're not looking at it through a different lens.
Absolutely. I think asking those questions, who am I including? Who am I excluding? Making sure you're keeping a pulse on the norms, the spoken and unspoken ones, is really important. And there is a ton of research out there for when, you are thinking about inclusive design, where it's helpful for literally everybody involved. in terms of folks who are not working directly in diversity, equity, and inclusion or in a different part of their journey, especially managers? How do you think we can really hold folks accountable who are leading teams across organizations to make their individual processes more inclusive, whether they're on marketing, sales, engineering, and across the company?
Yes, yes. So I'm a huge advocate for having company-wide goals and objectives that tie into inclusion. And those standards need to carry over across the business. So setting standards around psychological safety, like how do you do your one-on-ones? Are you actively, being able to participate in your career growth for all of your employees that you work with? Um, Thinking about even times of things for marketing and what typically gets missed, like one of the non-negotiables, to go back to, that was one of the companies that I've talked to, was having closed captions available on all of their meetings. Like it's something that, right, like it seems like something that's kind of like a no-brainer, but people, like companies, forget that. And to hold people accountable for what inclusion like means to them is going to be different for every group, but there's just some certain standards that everyone can like use as a checkpoint to look at, like, I want to be proactive and not just waiting for someone to say, hey, can you turn on closed captions? Just make the environment already ready for someone who may need them and don't have to ask, right? And so taking that, and then some of that comes with a little bit of what some education as well. I think once companies get awareness and education around the history of our societal norms and how that oppresses a lot of communities that are also part of their talent, will hopefully open some eyes on how are some different ways that they can make their environments more inclusive for each department. But it also too goes back to that question of, looking at how you run your department and your teams of, is everyone coming along for the change? Am
Yeah.
I being proactive about just not just making assumptions that, this particular way we do business is the only way to do it, right? And me, as being a program manager, I'm always brought in to challenge the status quo as it is, of, do we have to do this way just because we've always done it this way? Like, is there an opportunity to change? And uh, when we talk about holding everyone accountable, like, well, like one of the our local Austin companies kind of just told everyone, and they're all hands, like, inclusion is everyone's business here.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone has a responsibility. Every time you interact with another employee or multiple employees, every time you're working cross-functionally, you can't, you have to be intentional about that. And it's not just leaders, even though we harp on leaders a lot because it is important. It needs to come from the top down, but it's not they're not the only ones owning it, just like it is for company culture as a whole. The leaders don't just own company culture. Everyone at the company owns that culture. You all own a piece of it. And so being able to hold everyone accountable in the company should come from the top down, with the top respecting that um, they want to be able to empower everyone in the company to focus on making inclusive change. And in order to do that, one, you need to put some measurable goals in place. So are being able to see how are things changing in these different departments. But also you got to make yourself a little bit more vulnerable too. Like, I think leadership and especially mid management are in that position where I don't think sometimes they don't understand the gravity of how much their leading by example means for inclusivity. And then opening up that discussion and have some very candid conversations of, how can I change my own sphere of influence? You can see some really positive change, especially from a lot of organizations when you empower your mid-level management and your senior management to make those changes for their own groups.
Absolutely. I think that is so important. Inclusion is literally everybody's business. And I think really looking at key performance indicators, looking at where we are today and where we're trying to be, is really important in keeping a pulse on what is happening within an organization. We've talked about modeling and really building that trust. And some
Yeah.
organizations say, we have a really trustful environment. We have a quote unquote open door policy, but we know that some people, for a multitude of reasons, do not feel comfortable sharing their feedback internally with folks and have been
Mhm.
historically hesitant to share specifically with people or human resources teams. What are some methods that you use to really build trust within an organization and encourage folks to surface positive feedback, negative feedback, anything in between issues to those teams, human resources, and people?
Yeah. I am a big fan of surveys and pulse surveys and focus groups. And I would advise to like for when we're talking about the space of more equitable and inclusive spaces, it is okay for companies to say, hey, I think we need an outside party to help us examine this. Sometimes you might be too close for it at the very beginning, especially if you're trying to build that trust. So I think that most companies can learn from saying, like we want, because you could say those things all day, right? But I think what happens is like the action towards it. So one kind of goes back to what I was saying before, like you have to kind of be a little bit vulnerable yourself. The leaders need to be okay with understanding that not everybody is going to feel comfortable coming to you at first. You can't forget that power dynamic. Like as much as we try to erase it, it's there. And so having an anonymous channel is super helpful for these types of discussions at the very beginning, because that releases people a little bit from that that power dynamic of I want to be able to share what's really going on here, but I don't want the fear of retaliation or being judged. I just want to give that. And then once that information is collected, it's still not done yet. Like the way you built that trust is taking that information, good or bad, being transparent with what you found, and being able to speak to how you will make changes, and then actually sticking to those improvements. I think that I consider that like journey to trust is like a tightrope, really, especially like every organization is different, but if you're really trying to establish that kind of trust and you don't feel like you've had a lot of it, one, you're not going to get someone all the time that's honest to tell you something to your face. So you need to offer that anonymous outlet and still be the face of receiving that information, of saying this is what we found out, this is not, this is not the best news, but I appreciate everyone who was able to give us that feedback. This is what we want to plan to make these changes. And most important, if you're going to get in front of your company and share this data, good or bad, and say that you're going to make changes, you must follow through. That is that tightrope of trust that a lot of companies may be forgetting, is that you can get that information, can offer that anonymous outlet and say, hey, thanks to everybody for giving us this honest feedback. But if you sit on it, if you don't make active moves towards rectifying what data that you found, then you've fallen off that tightrope and you might not be able to get back up. Because even now, if you have that anonymous channel, who's going to want to use it? They know that, you're going to be wasting their time. You're not going to hear them. So I would say, like, when it comes to that open door policy and feeling like building that trust within the organization, you got to make yourself a little vulnerable as a leader, and then just move towards action, listening and doing, less speaking, more doing.
Yes, yes. I think that follow up is really important. Feedback is a gift. So asking for actively listening and then, reporting back of what you heard and what actions you're going to be taken, or providing the context of why, and then asking again and being really consistent, building those
Yes.
relationships intentionally is really important. And the power dynamics, you can't ignore them. They exist at work. Also, bias exists within all of us as
Mm-hmm.
well, whether it's conscious or unconscious. We're currently in March 2022, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that it was Women's History Month and International Women's Day. The theme is breaking the bias, and we want to break the bias 365 days a year. But I want to ask you how you think about kind of breaking the bias in your work.
Yes, yes. Oh man, time has passed. I can't believe it's March already.
I know.
Yeah, so things that I do and focus on for breaking the bias. I I like to challenge, especially when we are working in projects together, of intentionally focusing on who's in the room. And then I like to propose for folks of like, there's a little bit more weight to an organization, a person who's organizing a meeting. I say that one, you should be actively setting some ground rules and making sure that everyone has a chance to speak.
Mhm.
And I do this thing called, step up, step back. So I will speak, but I am very cognizant of how much floor time that I'm taking. And I
Yeah,
also make sure that me as the organization, the organizer of the meeting, there's always personalities that may want to take up more of the floor space.
of course.
I actually moderate that very much because we already know that there's lots of environments, especially, us and women, that, we get interrupted a lot sometimes in meetings. We don't get as much as the floor to talk. So I not only do I participate in that, but I actively work with other leaders, in the company to just to remind them that this is part of your responsibility that we can be working towards when we want to talk about breaking the bias. And one is making sure you have the right people in the room,
Mhm.
and two, just making sure that people have a chance to speak. And I cannot say this enough, there's a thing that we do call amplification, and so that a lot of that happens if someone that I'm talking offline, usually typically another woman who has this amazing idea,
Mhm.
when I come back in those meetings, I make sure that she gets the credit for that idea of, you know, Jane had this really cool idea for us to go this path and to do this direction. Just want to thank her for her time, but wanted to bring this up. And I, we talk about this here at Disco too, about that of, just getting into the habit of attributing credit is a huge part of being able to break bias, because a lot of times that credit is not given to the folks who've actually warranted it, which is usually the women, and they get forgotten a lot. Like we don't get to see like and highlight their talent and their contributions. So even if you're a part of a meeting and they're not in the room, that's where you still shine as breaking the bias. Like support and advocate for your employees who are not in the room, and even though they had an idea and they might not be there, attribute that to them, you know?
Absolutely. That credit is really important. I love amplification. I think that is a really great example of how you can break the bias individually as an organizer of a meeting, as a leader of who is in the room as well. And it speaks to that accountability piece to
Mhm.
creating an environment of inclusion. Clarissa, is there anything that I didn't ask that you want to share with folks who are listening, or maybe underscoring one to two key takeaways?
Yeah, I would say definitely the key takeaway is um, being intentional cannot be overstressed. Everyone knows, I think every individual knows when um, someone has done something as an afterthought,
Yeah.
right? And so we can feel that. And, other people can feel that as well. So I would say that when you want to take a step towards making a more inclusive environment, wherever your sphere of influence is to really just sit down and think about, how you want to approach it. Don't do something as a last minute. Plan it out. Think about like, going forward, I am going to make sure that everyone that I'm interacting with, that I know a little bit about them, and about some of their talent. I'm going to make sure that when I'm in meetings, I'm going to intentionally amplify for
Love
those. And then also, I'm going to educate myself. Like I said, there's a lot of learning and also a lot of unlearning,
that.
and
Mhm.
that is a very personal thing. And so I tell people to learn about history, learn about real history,
Mhm.
realize that there are generational and downstream effects to things that have happened even 50 years ago. It wasn't that long ago. And so to take that time and like unpack things that make you uncomfortable, because it's a very personal journey for you. And then also realize that, everyone has some sort of workplace trauma, and it's not fair to make assumptions. You have to just sit down and listen more than you speak, and then be able to collaborate with those before you do.
Yes, I think that is so important. Continue to be intentional and have those conversations, show others compassion, and really amplify folks as well. Clarissa, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture this afternoon. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This has been amazing.
Of course. And as a reminder for folks who are listening on All Voices, we really believe in that employee feedback management as a requirement for the organization to succeed overall. Have a good rest of your day, everyone.